London was a far cry from California. Amanda felt it in her bones. Gone was the familiar warmth of the sun. In its place, a cold, damp air clung to the city. Towering buildings cast long shadows, remnants of a history she was just beginning to understand. Cobblestone streets echoed with the footsteps of strangers. Amanda was determined to make this new life her own. London was a challenge, a puzzle she was determined to solve. The city's energy, both chaotic and captivating, was already seeping into her soul. Nighttime in London was a different beast. The fog rolled in, thick and heavy, swallowing the city in its embrace. Shadows danced in the flickering gaslight, stretching and twisting into monstrous shapes. Amanda, a creature of the night herself, found a strange comfort in the darkness. The city's nocturnal rhythm resonated with her soul. While others sought solace in daylight, Amanda embraced the shadows. She felt most alive in those quiet, stolen hours after the sun had set. The city's energy shifted, becoming something more subdued, more secretive. But beneath the surface, a current of unease ran through her. Her sanctuary became a small, unassuming cafe tucked away on a side street. The Midnight Brew, its sign proclaimed in faded gold lettering. It was a haven for night owls, insomniacs, and dreamers. Its dim lighting and the aroma of strong coffee provided a sense of warmth and belonging. Amanda would often find herself drawn to its warm glow late at night. The gentle clinking of cups, the murmur of hushed conversations, the aroma of coffee and spices. It was a sensory experience that soothed her soul. She'd settle into a worn leather armchair, a steaming mug of decaf cradled in her hands. Lost in the pages of a good book, she could almost forget the anxieties that plagued her during the day. The cafe was her escape, a place where she could simply be. Little did she know that her late-night ritual had attracted an unwanted observer. He was a phantom, a whisper in the night. A man of shadows and secrets, drawn to the glow of the midnight brew like a moth to a flickering flame. He blended into the background noise of the cafe, an anonymous figure amidst the late-night crowd. No one paid him much attention, and that's precisely how he liked it. His eyes, however, were constantly moving, scanning the room, taking in every detail. He was a predator, and the midnight brew was his hunting ground. He observed the late-night patrons, their routines, their vulnerabilities, but it was Amanda who caught his eye. He began to make a habit of sitting at the same table every night, always within view of Amanda. Section 2. Fleeting Glances. Amanda, lost in the pages of her book, was oblivious to the attention she was receiving. She was used to the anonymous hum of the cafe, the low murmur of conversations, the clatter of cups and saucers. It was a comforting soundtrack to her late-night ritual. She would occasionally glance up from her book, her eyes scanning the room without really seeing. It was more of a reflex, a way to ground herself in the present moment. But her gaze never lingered on any one person for too long. She had noticed him, vaguely, a few times. He was always sitting in the same spot, nursing the same cup of coffee. Section 3. Unsettling Awareness. The feeling began as a prickle on the back of her neck, a subtle shift in the atmosphere. At first, Amanda dismissed it as nothing more than her imagination, fueled by the dark narratives she consumed in her books. But as the nights wore on, the feeling intensified. It was as if someone was watching her, their gaze following her every move. She would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of her eye, a shadow shifting in the periphery. She started to pay more attention to her surroundings, scanning the faces of the other patrons in the cafe. But her search yielded nothing. Section 4. Seeds of Doubt. The feeling of being watched followed her home, seeping into the sanctuary of her small apartment. She began to question her own sanity, wondering if she was letting her imagination run wild. She would double-check the locks on her door, her windows, even though she knew she had already secured them. Her once comforting routines, her late-night trips to the midnight brew, her solitary walks home, were now tainted with fear. She felt like a prisoner in her own life, trapped by an invisible threat. Her phone buzzed, a jarring sound in the quiet apartment. Amanda's pulse quickened. It was a text, from an unknown number. Her finger hovered over the notification, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. Taking a deep breath, she opened the message. 3 words, chilling in their simplicity. I see you. A wave of nausea washed over her. It was just a text, she told herself. A cruel prank. But deep down, a primal fear whispered that it was something more. Days turned into a blurry torment. The texts continued, each one a hammer blow to her fragile sense of security. You looked beautiful tonight. You shouldn't walk home alone. They were vague, yet their intent was clear. He was watching her. The city, once exhilarating, now felt like a hunting ground. She avoided the cafe, her former haven now a source of terror. But it didn't matter. He knew her routines, her habits. The messages grew bolder, more specific. He described her clothing, her habits, even the way she nervously tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Details only someone watching her closely could know. Her blood ran cold. She went to the police, her voice trembling as she recounted the escalating terror. But the anonymous texts, the lack of a physical threat, left them with little to go on. They promised to investigate, but their words rang hollow. She was alone. The fear that had been a simmering dread now erupted into full-blown panic. Sleep, when it came, offered no escape. Nightmares plagued her, vivid and terrifying. He was always there, lurking in the shadows, his face obscured, his eyes burning with a cold, predatory light. She started seeing him everywhere, his face a fleeting glimpse in a crowd, a shadow disappearing around a corner. Her senses were on high alert, every sound magnified, every shadow a potential threat. Her once organized life dissolved into chaos. Work became impossible, her concentration shattered. I'm coming for you, the text read, simple, direct, and utterly chilling. The words echoed in the silence of her apartment, amplifying her terror. He was no longer content to watch from afar, he was coming closer. Panic threatened to consume her, but she clung to a sliver of defiance. She wouldn't be an easy victim. She grabbed the baseball bat she kept under her bed, her hand shaking as she gripped the worn wood. It was a pathetic defense, but it was all she had. That night, the creaks and groans of her old building seemed louder, more menacing. Days crawled by, each one an agonizing eternity. The silence from the stalker was more unnerving than the texts. It was the quiet before a storm, a suffocating stillness that pressed down on Amanda, stealing her breath. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like a prey animal sensing the predator's presence but unable to pinpoint its location. Her sleep was plagued by nightmares, vivid and unsettling, filled with shadowy figures and menacing whispers. Her apartment, once a haven, now felt like a prison. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the old plumbing sent shivers down her spine. Her phone buzzed, the sound cutting through the silence like a siren. Amanda flinched, her heart leaping into her throat. The screen illuminated her face, the glow casting harsh shadows in the darkness. It was him, 2 words, terse, unemotional, I'm outside. A cold dread washed over her, numbing her limbs. He was no longer content with cryptic messages, with toying with her from afar. Days turned into weeks. The stalker remained a phantom, a menacing presence lurking just beyond her reach. The fear, however, was a constant companion, a shadow that clung to her every move. She'd tried everything, changing her routines, her phone number, even her appearance. She'd reported the stalking to the police, but their investigation had stalled, hampered by the lack of concrete evidence. Desperate for a sense of normalcy, she'd ventured back to the Midnight Brew, hoping that familiarity might offer some solace. But the cafe, once her sanctuary, was now a constant reminder of her vulnerability. Every creak of the door, every whisper in the darkness, sent her heart racing. One evening, as Amanda sat in her darkened apartment, her phone buzzed with a message. It was another unknown number, but this time the message was different. It wasn't a threat, but a plea, a desperate cry for help. He's after me now too, the message read. Please help me. He knows about the cafe. A surge of adrenaline shot through Amanda. chasing away the paralysis of fear. For months she'd been consumed by her own terror, believing herself to be alone in this nightmare. Now, she realized, there was someone else. Another victim caught in the stalker's web. For the first time since this nightmare began, Amanda felt a flicker of hope. He'd made a mistake. He'd underestimated his victims, their resilience, their capacity for empathy and courage, and this mistake, she vowed, would be his downfall. Section 5. A desperate plea. Amanda knew she had to act fast. She didn't know the identity of the other victim, but the mention of the cafe was a crucial clue. He was watching them both, using their shared haven as a hunting ground. Her fingers flew across the phone's keyboard, her mind racing. "Don't go to the police," she typed. "He'll be expecting that. We need to be smart. Meet me at the park across from the cafe tomorrow night at 10 p.m. Come alone," and delete this message. Sending the message, Amanda felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with trepidation. She didn't know if the other victim would trust her, if they would even see the message in time. But it was the only chance they had. As she waited for a response, the fear that had been her constant companion for months began to morph into something else: determination. A fierce resolve to fight back, to expose the stalker and end his reign of terror once and for all. She was no longer just a victim, she was a hunter now. Section 1. The Confrontation. Amanda lay awake. Every nerve ending throbbed with a mixture of fear and anticipation. He was in her apartment. She knew it. The air itself felt different, charged with a dark energy. Earlier that night she'd heard the floorboards creak outside her door, just a soft, insidious sound, but enough to send chills down her spine. He was toying with her, letting her know he was close enough to touch. She gripped the baseball bat tighter, her knuckles white in the darkness, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the silence. The digital clock on her nightstand glowed an ominous red 3 a.m., the witching hour. A wave of nausea washed over her. She had to get out of this apartment, now. Suddenly a crash from the living room shattered the silence. Amanda bolted upright, her breath catching in her throat. He was inside. There was no more time for fear, only action. Section 2. Fight or flight. Adrenaline surged through Amanda's veins. Her fear was a living thing now, propelling her forward. She crept towards the bedroom door, each step agonizingly slow. The baseball bat felt heavy in her trembling hands, but it was all that stood between her and him. The hallway was dark, the only light filtering in from the streetlights outside. Shadows danced on the walls, taking on menacing shapes. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old building sounded like a whispered threat. Then, she saw him. A silhouetted figure standing in the living room, his back to her. He was hunched over something on the coffee table. She couldn't make out what it was, but a cold dread filled her. It was too late to run. He'd hear her. Her only option was to fight. With a surge of desperate courage, Amanda charged into the living room, her scream ripping through the silence. She swung the bat with all her might, aiming for his head. The bat connected with a sickening thud, and the figure crumpled to the floor. Silence descended once again, heavy and absolute. Amanda stood frozen, her chest heaving, the baseball bat trembling in her grip. Her mind struggled to process what had just happened. Had she really just... Slowly, cautiously, she approached the figure lying motionless on the floor. The room was illuminated only by the faint glow of the city outside, casting long, distorted shadows. It was difficult to see, but as she drew closer, she realized something was wrong. Terribly wrong. The figure on the floor wasn't the stalker. It was her landlord, Mr. Henderson. He lay sprawled on the floor, his eyes vacant, a thin trickle of blood staining his temple. He was still clutching a screwdriver in his hand. The air rushed out of Amanda's lungs. This wasn't her nightmare, it was someone else's. She was both victim and unwitting perpetrator in a tragedy not of her making. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. Looking around the apartment, she saw the chaos, the signs of a struggle, the overturned furniture, the broken lamp. Mr. Henderson hadn't been attacking her, he'd been trying to protect her. He must have heard the stalker, come to investigate and walked in on... The weight of it all crashed down on her, the months of fear, the relentless stalking, the constant dread, all culminating in this. Her legs gave way and she sank to the floor, her back against the wall, her eyes fixed on the horrifying tableau before her. She was safe now, but at what cost? The police sirens wailed in the distance, a symphony of approaching chaos. But Amanda couldn't bring herself to move. She sat huddled on the floor of her ransacked apartment, the weight of the night pressing down on her like a physical burden. The events played over and over in her mind, a horrific loop she couldn't escape. The image of Mr. Henderson lifeless on her living room floor haunted her, his kind eyes now forever closed, his gentle smile extinguished. She'd come to London seeking a fresh start, a chance to escape the ghosts of her past. Now she was leaving with a new ghost, one that would forever be tethered to her soul. London held nothing for her but pain and terror. She packed a single suitcase, her movements mechanical, her emotions numb. She didn't bother to sort through the debris of her life, the overturned furniture, the scattered belongings. It all felt tainted, poisoned by the events of that night. The next morning, she boarded a plane, the roar of the engines a deafening counterpoint to the silence in her heart. As the plane soared above the clouds, leaving London behind, a single tear traced a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of relief. She was free. Or was she? California welcomed her back with open arms, the familiar warmth of the sun a balm to her soul. She tried to rebuild her life, to piece together the shattered fragments of her former self. She found solace in the familiar rhythms of her childhood, the scent of the ocean breeze, the laughter of loved ones. But the shadows of that night in London followed her, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of her carefully constructed normalcy. She couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on her back, the prickling unease of being watched. She avoided crowds, shied away from strangers, her senses perpetually on high alert. Every creak in the night, every unexpected noise, sent a jolt of fear through her. The stalker might be gone, but the terror he'd inflicted lingered, a venomous seed planted deep within her psyche. She often thought about the other victim, the one who had reached out to her in a moment of shared desperation. Had they escaped the stalker's clutches, or had they too become ensnared in his web of terror? The questions haunted her, a constant reminder of the darkness that could lie hidden beneath the veneer of normalcy. Amanda might have escaped the physical clutches of the Night Stalker, but his presence lingered, a specter haunting the edges of her carefully constructed peace. The experience had changed her irrevocably. She was no longer the carefree young woman who had arrived in London so full of hope and optimism. She was a survivor, forever marked by the darkness she had encountered. And in the depths of her heart, she knew that the shadows would always be there, waiting to reclaim her. Adam thrived in the darkness. 14 years he had spent working the graveyard shift in museums, surrounded by echoes of the past. He knew the rhythm of the night, the way shadows danced in the moonlight. Each night was a journey through history, a solitary exploration of forgotten stories. But nothing in his years of experience had prepared him for this. The museum was a labyrinth of shadowy corridors and towering exhibits. Adam patrolled the halls, his footsteps echoing on the polished marble floors. He paused at the entrance to the Egyptian exhibit, a shiver crawling down his spine. The hieroglyphs lining the sarcophagi seemed to writhe and shift, their ancient power palpable. He moved on, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but the feeling of unease persisted, clinging to him like cobwebs. The silence, once a comfort, now felt oppressive. It was as if the very walls were listening, waiting for him to let down his guard. Something about this museum chipped away at his certainty, leaving him vulnerable and exposed. 2 weeks of unsettling quiet, fleeting shadows, and a growing sense of dread. He'd been hired for his experience, but nothing had prepared him for this. It started subtly, a flicker at the edge of his vision, a whisper that vanished quickly. As the days turned into nights, the incidents became more frequent. The shadows grew bolder, lingering in doorways, darting behind pillars. The whispers morphed into distinct sounds, a soft sigh, a muffled laugh, footsteps echoing through empty corridors. He started to feel a presence unseen but palpable following him. Adam had always dismissed supernatural tales as folklore. Now he wasn't so sure. It began simply, a flicker at the edge of his vision. Easy to dismiss as fatigue, but Adam knew the difference. There was a rhythm to the night, a predictable dance of light and shadow. This was something else. He found himself pausing more often, his gaze sweeping across the darkened exhibits. The feeling lingered, a prickle on the back of his neck, the unsettling sensation of being watched. The silence seemed to amplify every creak and groan of the old building. He chided himself for acting like a rookie. This was just a job, a paycheck. The flicker persisted, growing bolder each night. It began to intrude, a fleeting darkness darting across the walls. At first, Adam tried to ignore it, telling himself it was a moth, a bat, but deep down, a primal fear took root. One night, he swore he saw it again, a shadow slipping behind a statue. He froze, his heart pounding, but found nothing. He forced a laugh, a nervous expulsion of air that did little to ease the tension. By the fifth night, the flicker had morphed into a full-fledged shadow. Adam, his nerves frayed, decided to confront it. Near the medieval armory, he saw it, a tall, indistinct shape lurking in the shadows. "All right, that's enough," he muttered, stepping closer. "I don't know what you are, but this game is over." The shadow didn't move, remaining perfectly still. Adam, his heart hammering, took another step, raising the flashlight like a weapon. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but dust motes. Adam felt a chill run down his spine. He was alone. Or was he? The feeling of being watched intensified, prickling at the hairs on the back of his neck. He spun around, flashlight beam sweeping across the armory. Empty suits of armor stared back at him. He could have sworn he felt a breath on his neck, cold and fetid. His pulse quickened. He needed to get a grip. Adam found himself drawn to the Egyptian exhibit. It was the oldest, most unsettling part of the museum. He hated the way the air felt heavy, thick with the scent of dust and decay. And most of all, he hated the obsidian amulet. Carved from a single piece of obsidian, it depicted a scarab beetle. But it was the energy emanating from the amulet that unsettled Adam. It was as if the amulet held a consciousness, a malevolent intelligence that watched and waited. Tonight, Adam had come prepared with his trusty flask of whiskey. He knew it was foolish, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to happen. He took a long swig, feeling his anxiety lessen. "All right, you ancient relic," he muttered, staring down at the obsidian amulet. He spent hours pacing around the Egyptian exhibit, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The silence was unnerving, broken only by his own breathing. He was starting to think he was wasting his time when he heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible above his heartbeat. He froze, his flashlight beam wavering. He strained his ears, listening for any repetition of the sound. Silence. He was about to dismiss it when he heard it again, a whisper, soft and sibilant. It was a language he didn't recognize, sending chills down his spine. He shone his flashlight around the exhibit, but there was nothing there. And then, the lights flickered, and the museum was plunged into darkness. "Shit," Adam cursed, fumbling for his flashlight. The whispering grew louder, swirling around him. He had to get out of there. Panic swelled in Adam's chest. The whispers intensified, morphing into a low, guttural chant. He couldn't understand the words, but he could feel their malevolent intent. He backed away slowly, his heart pounding. The darkness was absolute, suffocating. His breath caught in his throat, every instinct screaming at him to run. He remembered the layout of the museum, the emergency exits, but fear drove him deeper into the darkness. He stumbled over something hard and metallic. He shone his flashlight down, realizing he was beside the empty pedestal where the amulet had been displayed. The case was empty. The obsidian amulet was gone. It wasn't just an object, it was something alive, something malevolent. He needed to get out, to call for help. But the whispers, now a cacophony of sound, seemed to press in on him, urging him forward, deeper into the labyrinthine corridors of the museum. He was no longer in control of his own actions, his body moving on instinct, driven by a fear so profound it bordered on madness. He stumbled through the darkness, his flashlight beam a beacon of futility in the overwhelming blackness. The air grew thick and heavy, filled with the scent of dust and decay, a suffocating miasma that seemed to cling to his lungs, stealing his breath. He could feel the whispers closing in around him, pressing against his skin like icy fingers, their voices growing louder, more insistent. The chanting had become a chorus, a symphony of shadows and whispers that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. Panic threatened to overwhelm him. He was trapped, hunted by something he couldn't see, couldn't understand. His flashlight beam darted frantically across the darkness, illuminating nothing but empty hallways and the occasional glint of glass from a display case. He was lost, disoriented, his senses overloaded by the oppressive darkness, the suffocating air, the relentless chanting that seemed to be closing in on him like a tightening noose. And then, through the darkness and the fear, he saw it. A faint light flickering like a candle flame at the end of the corridor. Hope surged through him, a lifeline in the sea of darkness. He stumbled towards it, his pace quickening, his fear momentarily forgotten in the desperate need to escape. As he drew closer, the light grew stronger, revealing the outline of a doorway, an archway leading into another part of the museum. He didn't recognize this section, but it didn't matter. All he cared about was getting out of the darkness, away from the whispers that seemed to be clawing at his sanity. He was almost to the doorway when the light flickered once and died, plunging him back into absolute darkness. A strangled cry escaped his lips as he stumbled to a halt, his hand flying out to brace himself against the wall. And that's when he saw it. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the faint light filtering in from the hallway beyond, was a figure. Tall, skeletal, its form shrouded in what appeared to be tattered robes. 2 points of light burned within the depths of its hood, like embers in the darkness. Adam froze, his blood turning to ice in his veins. The chanting stopped. An unnerving silence descended, broken only by the frantic pounding of his own heart. He stared at the figure, unable to move, unable to breathe. It was as if time itself had ground to a halt, every detail of that moment etched into his memory with terrifying clarity. The figure's stillness, the way it seemed to absorb the surrounding light, the 2 burning embers that locked onto his gaze with an intensity that seemed to pierce his very soul. He couldn't tell how long they stood there, locked in that silent confrontation. It felt like an eternity, a timeless void where fear was the only constant. Then, as slowly and deliberately as it had appeared, the figure began to move towards him. 1 step, 2. Each movement was agonizingly slow, measured, as if the figure was savoring Adam's terror, drawing it out, prolonging the moment. The air grew colder, the scent of decay stronger, until it felt like a physical presence, suffocating him, pressing down on him. Just as the figure was a step away, a hair's breadth from reaching him, the lights flickered back on. The sudden illumination was blinding. Adam blinked rapidly, his eyes struggling to adjust. He looked back to the doorway, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure was gone. The sudden return of light was like a physical blow. Adam reeled, his eyes stinging, his breath caught in his throat. The hallway stretched before him, empty, illuminated by the harsh glare of the emergency lights. The chanting had ceased, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt heavy, pregnant with unseen menace. He didn't hesitate, didn't waste a single second trying to rationalize what he'd seen. His body, fueled by adrenaline and raw terror, took over. He turned and fled, his footsteps echoing on the polished marble floor, the sound bouncing off the walls like the frantic beat of a drum. He didn't look back, didn't dare to see if the figure was following him. His lungs burned, his legs screamed for respite, but still he ran. The museum, once a place of wonder and intrigue, had transformed into a nightmare, a labyrinth of shadows and whispers that he was desperate to escape. He careened around corners, his flashlight beam a jittery beacon in the darkness, his mind a chaotic jumble of fear and adrenaline. The emergency exit seemed miles away, each corridor stretching endlessly before him, twisting and turning in a disorienting dance of shadows and light. The night air hit him like a slap, cold, crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain and something else, something ancient and unsettling that clung to the back of his throat like bile. He stumbled out of the museum, his chest heaving, his legs shaky beneath him. He didn't stop running until he reached the street, the harsh glare of the streetlights momentarily blinding him. The city, usually a symphony of noise and light, seemed strangely muted, as if holding its breath, observing him from a distance. He glanced back at the museum, its imposing facade looming over the street, its windows dark and lifeless. From this distance it seemed almost peaceful, a silent sentinel guarding its secrets. But Adam knew better. He had looked into the heart of that silence, had felt the icy breath of something ancient and malevolent. He stood there for a long moment, catching his breath, trying to slow the frantic beating of his heart. The events of the night replayed in his mind, a terrifying montage of shadows, whispers, and that final, chilling encounter in the darkened doorway. He reached for his phone, his fingers fumbling with the buttons. He needed to call someone, tell someone what had happened, but who would believe him? Who would understand? He was just a night watchman, a nobody paid to sit in the dark and pretend to guard against the impossible. He looked back at the museum, a shiver running down his spine. He could almost feel its gaze upon him, cold and calculating, as if daring him to return, to test its boundaries once more. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he would never be free of this place, that it had sunk its claws into him, marked him as its own. He thought about the amulet, the obsidian scarab beetle with its outstretched wings. Was it merely an object, a conduit for some unseen force? Or was it something more, something alive, something malevolent that had chosen him, singled him out for its own twisted purposes? He didn't know the answers, and for the first time in his life he didn't want to know. Some things, he realized, were best left buried in the darkness, locked away in the silent tombs of history. Adam turned and walked away from the museum, his steps slow at first, hesitant, then gradually gaining purpose. He didn't know where he was going, what he would do next, but one thing was certain: he would never set foot inside that building again. He had looked into the abyss, had felt the icy breath of something ancient and evil, and it had changed him. He was no longer the man he had been, the skeptic who dismissed the whispers of the night as mere superstition. He had seen the truth, had felt its touch, and it had left an indelible mark on his soul. As he walked, he could feel the city watching him, its lights seeming to flicker and dim as he passed. He was a stranger in a familiar land, marked by his encounter with the darkness, forever changed by the whispers that echoed in the silence of his mind. The museum stood silent, its secrets locked away once more. But the silence was different now. It was no longer empty, expectant. It was a silence filled with the knowledge of what had transpired, of the terror that had unfolded within its walls. It was a silence that held its breath, waiting, watching, for the next unsuspecting soul to cross its threshold and awaken the darkness within.
Anneliese Michel. A name whispered in hushed tones, a name synonymous with horror. She was a young girl from Germany, a devout Catholic. Her life, once filled with promise, took a sinister turn at the tender age of 16. Anneliese began experiencing strange occurrences. Visions plagued her, voices whispered in her ear, tormenting her with unholy pronouncements. Doctors, baffled by her condition, offered a clinical diagnosis: epilepsy. Medication was prescribed, but it provided no solace. Anneliese knew deep in her soul that this was no ordinary ailment. This is the story of Anneliese Michel. At first, the voices were faint, a mere whisper at the edge of hearing. Anneliese would brush them off, attributing them to an overactive imagination. But the whispers persisted, growing louder, more insistent with each passing day. They taunted her, mocked her faith, and filled her dreams with unspeakable horrors. The visions began subtly as well, fleeting shadows that danced at the periphery of her vision. But soon the shadows took on more sinister forms. Grotesque faces with eyes that burned like hot coals leered at her from the darkness. Anneliese, a devout Catholic, clung to her faith, seeking solace in prayer. She could feel a presence within her, a darkness that was slowly consuming her soul. The seizures began suddenly, racking her young body with violent convulsions. Doctors diagnosed her with epilepsy. Annalisa was prescribed a cocktail of drugs, each one designed to quell the seizures. But the pills brought no relief. The seizures continued, each one seemingly more violent than the last. And worse, the voices, the visions, they remained, undeterred by the pharmaceuticals meant to banish them. Her parents, though devout in their faith, were torn. They clung to the hope that the doctors were right. But as the weeks turned into months and Annalisa's condition worsened, doubt began to creep into their hearts. Annalisa herself never doubted the nature of her affliction. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that she was possessed. Annalisa's once vibrant life, filled with the simple joys of youth, was now consumed by darkness. She withdrew from her friends, her laughter silenced by the constant torment that raged within her. Her grades, once exemplary, plummeted as she struggled to focus on anything but the chilling reality of her possession. Her family, once a beacon of warmth and love, was slowly being torn apart by the strain of her condition. Annalisa's once peaceful bedroom became a battleground. The walls, once adorned with crucifixes and images of saints, now bore the marks of her desperate struggle. Annalisa's world, once filled with the promise of a bright future, had been plunged into a terrifying abyss. With medical science failing to provide any relief, Annalisa's parents turned to their last resort, the Catholic Church. They believed, with unwavering conviction, that their daughter was in the clutches of something evil, something beyond the realm of human understanding. They reached out to their local priest, a kind and gentle man who had known Annalisa since she was a child. But even he, a man of God, was hesitant to believe their claims of demonic possession. Finally, after months of searching, they found two priests, Father Ernst Alt and Father Arnold Renz, who were willing to listen without judgment. Father Alt, a man of stern demeanor and unwavering faith, had a reputation for his knowledge of ancient rituals and his unflinching resolve in the face of evil. Father Renz, younger and more compassionate, possessed a deep understanding of human suffering and an unshakable belief in the power of prayer. Together they formed a formidable duo, their strengths complementing each other perfectly. They understood the gravity of the task before them, the very real danger posed by the entities they were about to confront. The bishop finally granted his approval, though not without reservations. The first exorcism took place in a small room, the air thick with incense and anticipation. Annalisa, her once vibrant eyes now hollowed by suffering, sat rigidly on a chair, her body restrained by leather straps. Father Alt, his voice booming with authority, began the ancient rite. He invoked the name of God, demanding the demons to identify themselves, to release their hold on the young woman's soul. At first, there was silence. Then, a low growl emanated from Annalisa, growing steadily louder, more menacing. The battle had begun. The demons, angered by the priest's intrusion, unleashed their fury upon the room. Objects flew across the room with impossible force, smashing against the walls. Annalisa writhed in agony, her screams echoing the torment that raged within her. Father Alt, his voice unwavering, continued to recite the ancient rites. Father Renz sprinkled holy water on Annalisa, the blessed liquid sizzling like acid upon contact with her skin. The first encounter had only served to reveal the true nature of the enemy they faced. Ancient, powerful, and utterly ruthless. The exorcisms continued week after week, each session a brutal confrontation between the forces of light and darkness. Annalisa's condition, far from improving, deteriorated at an alarming rate. Her body, once healthy and vibrant, was now a ravaged battleground. She refused food, claiming the demons wouldn't allow her to eat. Her once healthy frame wasted away, her skin stretched taut over protruding bones. The demons, it seemed, were relentless in their torment, determined to break her body and spirit. Annaliese's once peaceful bedroom became a prison, a place of fear and suffering. The walls, once adorned with crucifixes and religious icons, were now bare, stripped clean by her own hand in a desperate attempt to silence the voices that taunted her from every corner. She saw things, horrible things, lurking in the shadows. Demons, their eyes glowing with malevolent glee, leered at her from the darkness. The air in the room was heavy with the stench of sulfur, a constant reminder of the demonic presence that had invaded her sanctuary. Her faith, once unshakable, was being tested to its very core. As the exorcisms continued, Annaliese's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She would lapse into periods of lucidity, her voice regaining its former sweetness, her eyes filled with a heartbreaking vulnerability. She spoke of her torment, of the constant battle raging within her soul. She begged for forgiveness, for release from the nightmare that had engulfed her. But these moments of clarity were fleeting, soon replaced by renewed onslaughts of demonic rage. Those who witnessed these transformations were left shaken to their core, their faith tested by the sheer intensity of the evil they witnessed. Throughout this ordeal, Annaliese's parents remained steadfast in their belief that their daughter was possessed, that only through exorcism could she be freed from the grip of the entities that tormented her. Anna Michel, Annaliese's mother, bore the brunt of her daughter's suffering. She cared for her tirelessly, comforting her during her moments of lucidity and praying by her bedside late into the night. She witnessed firsthand the toll the exorcisms were taking on her daughter's body and mind. Anna's love for her daughter was unwavering, a testament to the enduring power of the maternal bond. By the spring of 1976, a palpable sense of dread had settled over the Michel household. Annaliese, her body ravaged by months of relentless torment, was but a shadow of her former self. The once vibrant young woman was now skeletal, her skin stretched taut over protruding bones, her eyes hollowed out by suffering. The exorcisms, once a beacon of hope, had become a gruesome spectacle. Father Alt and Father Renz, their faces etched with fatigue and a growing sense of despair, continued their grim duty. The demons boasted of their power, their intention to claim Annaliese's soul for their own, to drag her down into the abyss. Section 2. The Price of Faith. Annaliese's parents, their faces etched with worry and exhaustion, clung to their faith as a drowning man clings to a lifeline. They believed with unwavering conviction that their daughter's suffering was a test from God, a trial by fire that she had to endure in order to find salvation. They refused to consider medical intervention, believing it would only serve to anger the demons, to prolong Annaliese's torment. They placed their trust in the Church, in the power of the exorcisms to drive out the evil that had taken root in their daughter's soul. But as Annaliese's condition worsened, their resolve began to waver. The weight of their decision, the knowledge that they were responsible for their daughter's well-being, pressed down on them with crushing force. They questioned their faith, their judgment, their sanity. Was this truly the will of God? Or had they, in their desperation, condemned their daughter to a slow and agonizing death? The guilt gnawed at their consciences, a heavy burden they carried alongside their grief. Section 3. A Life Extinguished. On the 1st of July 1976, Annaliese Michel drew her last breath. Her tortured body, finally succumbing to the relentless assault, found peace in death. The silence that descended upon the Michel household was deafening, a stark contrast to the screams and prayers that had filled the air for months. Annaliese's parents, their faces etched with grief and a profound sense of loss, knelt beside her bed, their hands clasped in silent prayer. Their daughter, their little girl, was gone, taken from them by a force they couldn't comprehend, couldn't control. Father Alt and Father Wren stood by, their heads bowed, their faces pale with shock and exhaustion. They had fought valiantly, had poured all their faith and energy into saving Annaliese's soul. But in the end, it hadn't been enough. The demons, it seemed, had claimed their prize. Or had they? The question hung heavy in the air, unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. Annaliese's death, a tragedy by any measure, left behind a void, a chilling testament to the power of belief, the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most devout faith. The news of Anneliese Michel's death sent shockwaves through the small German town, reaching a global audience hungry for sensationalism. The story, a chilling blend of faith, superstition, and tragedy, captured the imagination, sparking heated debates about the nature of good and evil. The authorities launched an investigation. Father Alt, Father Renz, and Annaliese's parents were charged with negligent homicide, accused of prioritizing their beliefs over her well-being. The trial captivated the world, revealing disturbing details. In the end, they were found guilty of manslaughter. They were sentenced to probation and suspended jail terms. The question lingered: what had truly killed Anneliese Michel? The quaint cemetery on the outskirts of Klingenberg, Germany, holds a dark secret. Amongst the weathered headstones and moss-covered angels lies a grave that draws the curious and the devout alike. It is the final resting place of Anneliese Michel, a name whispered in hushed tones. Her grave has become a pilgrimage site, adorned with rosaries, flowers, and handwritten pleas. They leave behind tokens of their devotion, their whispered prayers a testament to belief. Annaliese's story, like all good ghost stories, is shrouded in ambiguity. Was she truly possessed, or a victim of misdiagnosed mental illness? The debate rages on, fueled by conflicting narratives of faith and reason. Believers point to documented evidence, skeptics to the lack of concrete proof. Annaliese's story forces us to confront our beliefs and question what we hold to be true. The story of Anneliese Michel is a haunting one. It chills you to the bone, making you question the nature of good and evil. Was Annalise possessed by demons, or a victim of her troubled mind? There are no easy answers, no neat resolutions to this tale. The human mind is complex and often terrifying, capable of great love and compassion, but also unimaginable darkness. We seek answers, clinging to beliefs in a chaotic world. Annaliese's story reminds us of the power of belief. It forces us to confront our own vulnerability.